Okay, we are looking at some problems in section 8E here, and these are problems where you have two samples and they're asking you to find a confidence interval. Okay, so I kind of wrote that over here. So if a problem has two samples, as opposed to last week where we only had one sample, now we have two samples, and they're asking you to find a confidence interval. Basically, the same interval options that we had on the calculator from last week for one sample, now we have it for two samples. So instead of a 1 prop z interval, now we have a 2 prop z interval. Instead of a t interval, now we have a 2 samp t interval. And instead of a z interval, now we have a 2 samp z interval. So the idea between the three of them is the same as if you have one sample. So it's the same logic as in sections 8A, 8B, and 8C. But just to go over that again. So in general, you have two main types of problems. You have proportion problems and you have average problems. So if it's a proportion problem, now the question is, how do you identify that? I always think of that as what I have written here. They're not giving you averages. They're not giving you standard deviations and the proportion types of problems. Instead, they're giving you that I have, this many people out of this many people. Okay? So an example of that, looking at question 2 here. Okay? It says they were looking at 239 people, and out of them, 101 of them were a dog person. Notice, no standard deviations, no averages. All they give you is that I have this many people out of this many people. When that's the setup, it's a proportion problem. Okay, so I would identify this problem here as a 2 prop z interval. Okay, and we'll go over kind of what it looks like on the calculator in just a second. But I would say 70% of the problem is just picking the right one of these three options. Okay, if it's not a proportion problem, and instead it's having averages, looking at question 7 here, okay? So kind of jumping down to where the numbers are, it says we took a sample of 27 Portland classes. Out of those 27 classes, based on that little sample of 27 classes, the mean was 38 and the standard deviation was 6, okay? So this problem looks very different than the one that we were just looking at, okay? The one that we were just looking at, question 2, just said I have this many people out of this many people, period. But here, it's saying I have this many classes, and I have this average and this standard deviation. That's how you know you're either looking at a 2 samp t or a 2 samp z interval. Okay, so they're very, very, very similar. This is probably the trickiest thing, okay, in this section. How do you make that distinction between, do I use a t or a z? Okay, the difference comes from, zoom in on the standard deviations. Okay, both types of problems will have two samples in them, so that's not the giveaway. Okay, the giveaway, how you decide which one to use, is where does your standard deviation come from. So for this first one, you're going to use the 2 samp t interval if you're given standard deviations for just your little samples. Okay, it's just for your little samples. It's not calculated based on all, it's just from your little sample. So if you're looking at question 7, zoom in on this sentence here. A random sample of 27 classes found a mean of 38 and a standard deviation of 6. Okay? These two numbers were calculated based on these 27 classes. They were not calculated based on all Portland classes. It was just on our little sample that this 38 and 6 were calculated. So if those two numbers are calculated based on a sample, you're going to use 2 samp t interval. Okay? This third option, 2 samp z interval, that's what you're going to use if you're given a standard deviation for all data. Okay? So looking at question 7, I'm going to change it to show you an example of what that would look like if it was a 2 samp z interval problem. If this had said, this highlighted sentence, a random sample of 27 Portland classes found a mean of 38 students per class, period, end the sentence. And then if it said based on all Portland classes, we calculated a standard deviation of 6. Okay? If it was stated that way, that the standard deviation was based on all Portland classes, then you would be using the 2-samp Z interval. Okay? So it's a very subtle difference, but it's all about where does your standard deviation come from. Okay? In terms of how to put them in the calculator, I'm not sure if you're having trouble there or not. One thing I would point out, make sure you're not using these guys up here. Don't use the ones that end in test. You're going to scroll down. Okay, and they're down here towards the bottom. So for example, here's 2-samp Z interval. Just like before, you have the option of data versus stats. If they give you a list of data, or 2 lists of data, you'd have to enter the data in L1 and L2, and you would leave this as data. Or if they give you the statistics for the data, then you would put it in here. Okay? Let me know if you're having trouble with putting it into the calculator there. Usually people have trouble on just picking the right one. That was the 2-samp Z interval. Here's the 2-samp T interval. Same thing here with data versus stats. If you have the actual data, you put it in L1, L2, and you switch this to data. If you have the stats, like I think most of these problems in this section, you have the stats, not the actual data. But it's possible to have the data. You would put in those numbers here. Just one comment. In this course, we will not use this pooled option, so leave that as no. Okay? So nothing too different there. And then the 2-prop Z interval. Okay, it looks like that. Where the X1 is like how many people you have out of a sample size of N1. And then this is for the other sample. Okay, so in terms of typing it in, it's pretty straightforward there. The other thing I wanted to mention was this bit down here. They could ask you to give a confidence interval in 2 different formats. Okay, so you have to pay attention to which format they want. So the first format, which is maybe I would say the most common, is basically just tell me what your calculator said. The left endpoint and the right endpoint. Okay? So like looking at question 7 here, that's what they're looking for. Left endpoint, right endpoint. Okay, so whatever the calculator gives you, make sure you round it to however they want you to round it. You put those numbers in, done. Okay, so those are the easier ones. Question 6, here they're asking you for a slightly different format. Okay, see how this has that plus or minus in the middle? As opposed to number 7, there was no plus or minus in the middle. If they're giving you a plus or minus, they're wanting you to write it this way, where it's midpoint plus or minus margin of error. Okay, and just to remind you, I just jotted this down. The midpoint you find by taking your left and your right endpoints that the calculator gives you, add them together, push enter, then divide by 2. That's what you would put in first. And then the margin of error you find by finding the length of your interval, which is doing the right endpoint minus the left endpoint, push enter, and then divide by 2, and that goes here. Okay. One thing I would mention just for rounding, some students ran into some rounding errors. However it says to round, don't do that until the very end. Okay, so if it says to round to 2 decimal places like this problem 6, don't do that with your endpoints from your calculator. Carry that out like 4 decimal places. Write down more than you need. Only round to do 2 decimal places at the very last step, else you're going to get some rounding error. Okay. Those are the 2 big ideas. Make sure you pick the right one here, and once you pick the right one, make sure you have it in the right format. Okay. So let me know if you want more past that. Hopefully that gets you started though. So good luck.